Hello, I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the panel discussion today. I'm Jim Manley, attorney at Pacific Legal Foundation, and I lead our free speech practice group. I want to thank you for logging in and thank you to all of our incredible panelists for taking the time to dig into the important issue of cancel culture. The PLF has a long history of fighting for free speech, including two victories at the Supreme Court in Keller versus State Bar of California, where we defended the right of attorneys to decline to fund political speech they disagreed with, and in Minnesota Voters Alliance versus Mansky, where we protected voters' right to wear political apparel, like a t-shirt with the text of the Second Amendment or a button that says "ID me" when they go to vote. And we've continued that commitment with more than a dozen current cases seeking to protect everything from the right to post a sign marking the edge of your property to the right to publish as a freelance journalist. And we engage in this defense of the First Amendment for the same reason we fight for property rights or economic liberty, equality under the law, and separation of powers. Because we believe, as Reagan did, that individuals have the ability, the dignity, and the right to make their own decisions and determine their own destinies. We think free speech is critical to individualism because free speech is necessary to sustain free thought and free action. Everything from science to art to religious and political debate, they all depend on free speech. And every one of us earns our livelihood through creative activity and trade that's facilitated by speech. Some of us speak for a living, but all of us rely on commercial messages, whether they're advertisements or product descriptions, to sustain and improve our lives every day. The free exchange of ideas and information is vital for human progress, both in our intellectual and material lives. And our discussion today is more concerned with the intellectual side of the coin, about the value of the free exchange of ideas and how, or even if, we should engage with views that strike us as wrong or short-sighted or even dangerous. Now, the cases I mentioned earlier, Keller and Mansky, I think nicely highlight two aspects of the problem. Keller holds that individuals shouldn't be forced to support views they disagree with, while Mansky limits the restrictions government can place on political dialogue. And so how do those ideas about choosing to remain silent and freeing political speech fit into this debate over cancel culture? We're fortunate to have a truly all-star panel here today to help us think through those and other issues that cancel culture brings to the fore. Now, this panel hardly needs any introduction, so I'm going to leave the difficult task of making those introductions to my colleague, PLF's creative manager, Joseph Cast. Joseph.
Thank you. Yeah, so we've got three great panelists, probably known to everybody watching, but if somehow they aren't, let me describe each of them a little bit. First, we have Professor Eugene Volokh, who is the Gary T. Schwartz Distinguished Professor of Law at UCLA, where he teaches First Amendment law, among other topics. He's written over 90 law review articles and several textbooks on the First Amendment and academic legal writing. His articles have been cited in 8 Supreme Court cases and over 200 court cases generally. But this audience probably knows him best as the founder of the Volokh Conspiracy, one of the most influential and widely read legal blogs in the country, if not the universe. Next, we have Professor Nadine Strossen, who is the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law Emerita at New York Law School. She's also a civil rights activist, an author, and the former president of the ACLU. The National Law Journal named Professor Strossen one of America's 100 most influential lawyers. Her most recent book, Haidt, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, which I have an autographed copy of, received well-deserved praise from across the ideological spectrum. And third but not least, we have Professor Jonathan Haidt, who is a social psychologist at New York University's Stern School of Business. He's well known for his pioneering research into morality and how it varies across cultures and political orientations. Professor Haidt co-founded Heterodox Academy, which is a network of more than 4,000 professors who advance viewpoint diversity in academia, something sorely needed right now. He's also the author of 3 best-selling books, The Happiness Hypothesis, The Righteous Mind, and with co-author Greg Lukianoff, The Coddling of the American Mind, all of which are fantastic books. So I thought I'd just start us off with something we often hear amongst critics of cancel culture, which is that it's overblown, not really a big deal, not actually a problem. After all, being kicked off of Facebook or getting fired from your job isn't necessarily as bad as being thrown into a gulag. If I could start with Professor Strossen, how would you answer that? Is it overblown? What's your opinion?
Sadly, it's not overblown. I was one of the signers of the Harper's letter this summer. It became quite controversial. And one of the reasons why I signed that letter and why I continue to be very concerned about this phenomenon is not so much about people like those of us on this panel who are able to find forums, but people who are not as well known. In particular, in my field, I constantly encounter students who are so fearful of being subjected to the Twitter mob that they are engaging in self-censorship. I should also say, though, that many professors and journalists and people who are quite well known have been subject to this kind of mob pressure that has resulted in their losing jobs, in their losing publication contracts, and other opportunities. For me, as an educator, Joseph, the most tragic instance of cancel culture, meaning just denying somebody a really important opportunity because of one incident, is the number of students who have been accepted to colleges who have had those admissions retracted because somebody has deliberately gone through their social media feeds and found some idiotic, insensitive, offensive post, can you imagine, that they made when they were a teenager, and therefore denying them an educational opportunity for which they were otherwise deemed well qualified. One other point before one could go on and on about this. Of course, people who are calling for cancellation are themselves exercising free speech rights, which I defend their right to do, but I think it's really important that those of us who oppose the cancellation raise our voices to argue against it. And in some cases, that has worked and has prevented the cancellation.
Great. I'm curious if Professors Haidt or Volokh have an opinion. Is it overblown? Are we being babies about this problem?
Well, I think when the term was first publicized, it was possible to say, oh, come on, this is just a few anecdotes. And when Greg Lukianoff and I wrote an article called The Coddling of the American Mind in 2015, we heard a lot of people say that. But 2 years later, it was clear, especially if you're at universities, professors had spoken to enough students or enough other professors to find out that we were actually beginning to self-censor, our students are self-censoring. So I think there's I agree with everything Nadine said, but I would add on two elements, two reasons why I think it's such a terrible thing. The first is that it's basically the social death penalty. That is, if somebody says something and someone disagrees with them, or if 5 people disagree with them, that's fine. That's the normal give and take. That's why free speech is beneficial in finding the truth. But cancel culture, one of the principles of it is you make no effort to see what the person really said or what the context was. It's about cutting them off. It's about calling for their ostracism. So yes, an individual has free speech rights, but there's this new phenomenon enabled by social media in which almost anyone can trigger a cancel campaign against anyone else, and it's social death, which is very, very painful, especially for young people. I think one of the reasons why teen suicide has gone up so drastically since they all got on social media in 2011 or 2012 is that social death, it leads to people wanting to actually commit suicide. And then just the other thing to say is that in addition to the cruelty of it, it really prevents institutions from doing what they're supposed to do, because it leads, as Nadine said, students, if they're self-censoring, if they won't say what they think, well then in the classroom we can't achieve the telos or purpose or goals for which our academic institutions are designed. Eugene, you're muted.
I agree with almost all of the substance of what John and Nadine said. I do think it's important to realize that it's not the gulags. It's not even modest amount of jail time. I appreciate the rhetorical force of social death, but it's not death, and it's not even really social death. So we need to keep things in perspective. It is true, it is not as serious a problem as it would be if the government were throwing people in prison for ostensibly fake news or for hate speech or anti-government speech or whatever else. But it's a problem, and it's a problem in large part for the reasons that John mentioned, which is that the threat of being fired, the threat of losing your opportunity to go to the college you want, even if ultimately you could probably get another job, maybe not quite as good, you still survive, still enjoy life, still play all the video games you want, it's not that bad, but still that threat deters people, powerfully deters people from expressing themselves. And as a result, all of us are losers, because the people who are deterred from expressing themselves aren't just kind of the idiots who don't have anything useful to say, or maybe the Klansmen or the Stalinists who, really practically how much is lost. Something may be lost, but not that much, perhaps, if they decide on their own not to speak. It's people who have any views that they think are dissenting in some measure, or might be viewed as dissenting 5 or 10 years from now. That is poison for the academy, where we can't know what's true. I mean, everywhere, but especially in the academy, it's understood you can't know that something is true unless people are free to say the opposite. And then their arguments are actually substantively disproven rather than just rejected out of hand. It's the same with regard to democracy writ large, that if we have an election, then what makes this election fair is precisely that people can express their views on all sides of all of the issues. So I think I don't want to exaggerate it. It's not the same as the gulags. It may not be that different from the 1950s Blacklist, by the way. You don't have the same degree of criminalization that was present, modest amount of criminalization that was present with regard to the communists. You don't have the same degree of coercive exposure as was present in the 1950s. But a lot of McCarthyism was all about cancellation through private action. And it was bad for the country. And this is bad for the country too.
And I was going to say Blacklist because one of the most recent manifestations of cancel culture are efforts to blacklist anybody who was in the Trump administration, right, or quote unquote their so-called allies. And there are serious efforts afoot at many campuses, including my own alma mater, Harvard, and many others, to ban, just hundreds, thousands, the numbers are staggering, to contemplate from having any opportunity to give lectures, to have visiting professorships, to have book contracts, media interviews. And if you're going to talk about a deterrent effect, does this mean that people are going to be afraid to support a candidate, even a candidate who ends up being elected president of the United States and has a record number of votes the second time around? I mean, the chilling effect is really, potential chilling effect is really staggering and frightening.
So I think that's absolutely right. Let me just add one more thing from the perspective of, well, at least the way I think universities and especially law schools should perceive this. At UCLA Law School, I'm teaching future lawyers. Future lawyers have to be able to make arguments to all sorts of people, judges, juries, opposing counsel in some situations, clients. And the fact is 47% of the voting public voted for President Trump. Or no longer President Trump. But in any event, they voted for him. They are a reality. Even if you think all of them are deplorable, even if you think every single one of them, including the Black and Hispanic voters, are white supremacists, even if you sincerely believe that, you need to be able to argue to them as a lawyer, and I think also in other fields as well. The problem is, at UCLA Law School, my guess is maybe there were 1 or 2 people on the faculty who actually voted for Trump, either one of the times. Maybe 3 or 4, although I doubt it. Could be as few as 0, but I suspect there probably were 1 or 2. So as a result, the students never have had the experience of talking to a faculty member, or often even talking to a student who's willing to admit that he voted for Trump. You don't have to be persuaded that those people were right to vote for Trump, but you need to learn a little bit about how to talk to people like that, because otherwise you'll find yourself that on some courts, you'll get the votes of the 7 justices. You'll vote on a state Supreme Court. You'll get the votes of 2 because you know how to argue to those 2. The remaining 5 who happen to be conservative, as they are in many states, well, you just never had the experience of trying to reach out to them and talk through things in a way that they would find persuasive. That's just devastating to the educational process.
Absolutely. Now we've talked a little bit about, you know, the people who find themselves on the other end of the cancellation. I'm kind of curious, Professor Haidt, from a social psychological standpoint, why do people like to take part in these pile-ons? Is it driven by boredom, these lockdowns? Do they have a sincere quest for justice? What do you think motivates these people?
Well, as a social psychologist, I think a lot about how people get prestige. Whenever you are new in an institution, you're trying to figure out how do they do things around here. You want to be accepted. You want to be respected. It's especially important for teenagers, and so we've always been jockeying for position and trying to get associated with, you know, good things or winning ideas. But something happened to the basic operating system of society between 2009 and 2011. Social media before 2009 was not terribly addictive or polarizing. It was just, you know, here's my Facebook page, here are the bands that I like, here are my friends. But in 2009, we got the like button, the retweet button, a lot of measures of user engagement, and then the companies algorithmicize the feed and things go viral. So the basic structure of social climbing, social relationships, it changes radically between 2009 and 2011. And that's when you get huge, those are the main years that people migrated onto daily use of social media. All the weirdness that we're talking about, it really takes off around 2014, 2015. And I think that social media is a big part of the story. So the most direct answer to your question is because the social payoff matrices change radically. Now, here we're talking about the positive payoffs. You know, you get likes, or you get followers, or you get good comments. But in general, in psychology, bad is stronger than good. And the downside of social media is so much worse than the upside is good. So I think at least when we see professors piling on, I think it's more driven by fear than the desire for prestige. It's driven by the fear that you'll be next. So in chapter 5 of The Coddling of the American Mind, Greg Lukianoff and I analyze the dynamics of witch hunts throughout history, all the way up through McCarthyism. And the social dynamics are absolutely fascinating, but that's what makes people jump in so quickly. Is they're afraid, because if you don't condemn this person that is now on the outs, if you don't condemn them, people will go through your feed and they'll say, "Why didn't you? You didn't condemn them. Silence is violence." So it really just makes a mess. It makes a mess of important social institutions, and it converts it all to like a middle school, backbiting social network.
Thank you. We did get a question from the audience after Mr. Volokh was speaking. Is self-censorship the objective of cancel culture? Is that the whole point? So
I have a thought about this, but I should first note that the 4-person screen just seems so 24. It's like you're just waiting for Jack Bauer to appear. So one of these things. Maybe you could replace one of us with Jack Bauer. So I think the answer is, in considerable measure, yes. But what makes it complicated is not all self-censorship is bad. That we censor ourselves all the time, and much of it is benign. Occasionally, I get emails from readers saying, "Why aren't you blogging about the subject?" I say, "I don't know enough about it to really opine on it." in a thoughtful way that people should be able to trust. He said, no, you're just afraid to blog about it. And I say, exactly. I'm afraid of looking like a fool. And more people should be afraid of looking like fools. So I think that in some measure, for example, when an academic writes even perfectly politely about somebody saying, this person made this argument, but it's just really mistaken for the following reasons, that creates a deterrent effect, and that's actually intended to create a deterrent effect. I think few academics in that situation would say, yeah, I want to silence that person. But one important feature of properly operating academic discourse is that people are very careful in their assertions to make sure that they are defensible and they're factually accurate and they're logically supported, because of a fear that otherwise somebody will point this out. Likewise, some degree of self-censorship comes from the desire of not coming across like a schmuck. And it's to some degree, that's actually quite helpful. Like to the extent that people, instead of really going hard against somebody and insulting them, even in situations where the other person really is badly wrong, if they understate it, if they say, I think this person might be mistaken, rather than the guy's an idiot. That's good. I think on balance, that creates a more helpful discourse, but it means we're some measure self-censored from being rude. The difficulty is that, as with many things, it has its dark side as well as its bright side. It has the vices of its virtues in many respects. That our desire not to come across as fools or as rude or as evil or whatever else, in many situations leads us to not speak out about things that are really important and not to convey our views on subjects where we really have something valuable to add. So the trick is to try to organize the kind of the ecosystem of discourse, both in general and within particular institutions like universities, to promote the valuable forms of self-expression while maintaining the valuable forms of self-censorship.
I think the main distinction between healthy self-censorship, which is part of a healthy discourse on campus and elsewhere, and unhealthy cancel culture is that in a healthy, vibrant discourse, you are seeking to pursue the dialogue, to exchange and refine and refute and debate ideas and perhaps change minds, whereas the goal of cancel culture seems to be, as the word implies, to end the discussion, to take not only certain ideas and certain subjects off the table entirely, but to take certain people out of the discussion entirely. It is effectively the death penalty. You said one wrong thing, we don't want to hear anything else from you ever again.
Yeah, I'd like to build onto what my colleagues here have said. Your question was about what's the goal of cancel culture, as if cancel culture has a goal. And what I'd like to add is a more of a sociological perspective in which, in part, what's going on here can be understood by bringing in the sociologist Emile Durkheim, who's one of my favorite social scientists of all time. And Durkheim taught us to see emergent social events as things in themselves that have a kind of a life of their own and a function. And in a Durkheimian perspective, you see a lot of things as being about calling the group together and building up the community, building up the congregation. And so a lot of these events have a kind of a religious structure to them. And I've got a list of 20 people who've been writing about how cancel culture and wokeness is really just expressions of our religious psychology and with a particularly Christian feel to them. When writing The Coddling, I found this really great essay by a sociologist who said it was a Durkheimian theory of witch hunts. And he used the Chinese Cultural Revolution as its primary example. But the three features of a witch hunt, I think, are helpful here. He said, it's clear that it's a witch hunt if, one, these things arise quickly. They appear, these dramatic outbursts that just seem to come out of nowhere. And that's what we have, like on a campus, somebody writes a perfectly nice email, and before you know it, people are outraged. Hundreds of people are outraged. The second feature is that they involve crimes against the collective. And this helps explain why, at least in the academic context, one of the surest ways to trigger one of these outrage mobs is to criticize something about diversity, inclusion, training, or policy. So Brett Weinstein at Evergreen, or Erica Christakis at Yale. If in some way you say anything about those topics, that is seen as a crime against the collective. And by the collective, we don't mean the entire university. We mean the community of activists that feel like they are fighting a campaign against evil. And then the third property is that the charges are often trivial or fabricated, because it isn't really about what's being said. It's just, is there an excuse for us to call the band together, call the mob together? And then Greg and I added on a fourth feature, which we see in all the academic cases, is the fear of defending the accused. So whoever's accused, all the other professors might privately sympathize, and they'll maybe say so privately, but publicly they either won't say anything, or often they'll even join the mob. So I think we need a sociological perspective to understand why these things happen. What is the goal of them? It's not necessarily focused on shutting down speech. I think it's focused on strengthening the group that is pursuing political ends.
So I think that's exactly right. But I want to add one more thing that some people have already pointed out, that social media has changed. It used to be that when you get 10 complaints, and you could be a business, you could be a university, your reaction is, well, all right, 10 people have complained. That's probably the tip of the iceberg. Probably thousands of people just haven't taken the time and effort to write a letter or even to send an email. So the result is you take those things quite seriously. Now you can get 10,000 signatures, and that's not the tip of the iceberg. It turns out it's actually bigger than the iceberg. The actual number of people who are outraged is probably a lot less than that. But the result is that I think a lot of times universities, for example, the reaction is, oh my God, we need to do something. We need to take stern action to convey to students that we're taking them seriously. Whereas I think the right answer, even if there are serious allegations, to say, interesting, we appreciate that. We have a complaint process. It's generally not through change.org petitions or through public letters, although you're free to speak whatever you want to say. But if you want to submit a complaint through the normal channels with whatever backing documentation you might have, we're going to take it up in the normal course of things. Don't expect that we'll deal with these things immediately, in part because our tenure contracts, for perfectly good reasons, provide for some serious procedural protections, which I'm sure we all agree all employees in our institutions ought to have. So I think if that were the reaction, I think the real complaints, there are real complaints that have real basis, I think could be investigated. The ones that are sort of flash in the pan, somebody ginning stuff up, would largely wither on the vine. But the problem is the outrage mobs look so large. It looks like this giant mob, but that's just because the technology has made it so easy for people to cheaply just say, okay, fine, I'll sign on.
Thank you. Changing gears a little bit, I think we had the most high-profile deplatforming or canceling of all history occurred a couple weeks ago when then President Trump was kicked off of Twitter, Snapchat, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Shopify, PayPal, and Twitch in a matter of hours. I'd like to ask Nadine, do you think this was a good decision, and would you have done the same?
I think it was a very dangerous decision. On balance, I understand the reasons why the decision was made from a business perspective. I understand the pressures that were coming from many users. I certainly defend the free speech right of these platforms to have made that decision. But on balance, when we consider who the person was and to whom he was trying to speak, namely the leader of the free world, the commander-in-chief, and the chosen president of 70 million Americans. When you deplatform somebody like that, you are not only depriving him of a uniquely influential opportunity to get his message out. Of course, he has other opportunities, but you are also depriving we, the people, his supporters, as well as his critics, of a vital opportunity to engage with his ideas. The United States Supreme Court said that when speech is about public affairs or about or by public officials, it is more than mere self-expression. It is the essence of self-government. And the opposite of self-government, by we the people and our elected officials being accountable to us, is completely unaccountable decisions by powerful platforms, accountable at most to their board of directors, which in the case of Facebook means to Mark Zuckerberg himself. As a civil libertarian, I am deeply fearful of and skeptical of government abuse of power. But I am also at least as skeptical and fearful of private sector abuse of power because of the lack of checks. You know, for Donald Trump, we could vote him out of office. We can impeach him. We don't have those options. I think in some very serious ways, Mark Zuckerberg poses a much greater danger to free speech in the sense of meaningful, robust free speech, not just in the technical First Amendment sense, at least as much of a danger as Donald Trump did.
Absolutely. Oh, Eugene, do you have a comment?
Yeah, so I think that what Nadine said is exactly right. And one way of thinking about it is to ask what you think about Citizens United. Now, I agree with the majority in Citizens United, which said that corporations and unions have the right to speak out about candidates. But certainly somebody who disagrees with the majority, who agrees with the 4 justices in dissent, or the many critics of Citizens United, and who thinks that it's dangerous for democracy to have large business corporations have undue influence on the political process, should be even more worried about Facebook, an extremely large corporation, or Twitter, a merely very large corporation, having power not just through speaking, because that's all that Citizens United was about corporations buying ads, which would then compete for people's attention and aim to persuade people based on what they say, but instead here these corporations have the power to block others' speech. So I think people who are concerned about corporate power, were concerned about it in the context of Citizens United, should be triply concerned about it here, because these are corporations that have much more influence within their niches than the say GM could buy an ad, but it'll just be one of many ads. And these are corporations that are restricting speech and not just engaging in speech. Now, I think that people who are the majority in Citizens United might still say, we agree that Twitter and Facebook should be able to say what they want to say. For example, respond to particular tweets and mark them as, we think this is fake and we want to point you to the right answer. That they should have the power to do that, but we might be much more troubled, whether that should be some legal reaction to it or not, but at least much more troubled by them not just responding to speech with their own speech, but responding to it with blocking. So I think a lot has to do with how much you worry about the private corporate power. And I'm with Nadine. I love capitalism. I love private property. I think there's a lot to be said for having a lot of power for people to control their own property. But the bigger you are, the more influential you are, the more of a monopoly you have in the particular niche, even if not a legally sanctionable monopoly, the more troubled we should be about your power, just as we are about the power of big government.
This is good. We might. Oh.
I'm so sorry, because I think of Eugene as a libertarian. I'm a liberal-tarian, but I was really pleasantly surprised when I saw an interview in the Wall Street Journal by Richard Epstein, very prominent, respected libertarian, arguing that these companies we should at least seriously think about treating them as regulated utilities that are so essential for people's everyday lives that they have a legal obligation. He was going back to ancient common law precedents to treat all of their users in a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory way.
We're libertarian-ish.
Okay, well, I'll take a slightly dissenting view here. This may be the only area where we disagree, but I think that it may have been the right decision. I was pleased by the decision. I would certainly say it has to be done in a viewpoint neutral way, and it clearly is not going to be done that way. The platforms are not just responsive to their users, they're extremely responsive to their employees, and the employees are always going to lean left. And so the way this is going to get done is going to be clearly partisan, and that's going to cause cynicism and separation. So, I recognize the many dangers. I agree with Nadine and Eugene that there are many problems and dangers as this is going. But I think the idea that they would kick people off now and then is a very good one, because the platforms, we're used to thinking about there's the telephone company, and we would never hold the telephone company responsible for a conversation that happened over their lines. And then there's our broadcast networks and newspapers, and we do hold them responsible. They have some editor, they have responsibilities for what they publish. And clearly, I should say I'm not the legal theorist here, but it seems as though if we have two bodies of sort of social understanding and jurisprudence, and these are somewhere in the middle, and so some sort of moderation of content, some sort of limitations on what users can do on the platform enforced by being kicked off, I think is actually a good idea. Throughout this conversation, and in almost everything I think about these days, I always try to think, what is the telos or purpose or goal of this institution? What are they trying to do? And if what we're trying to do is have these are now the public square, these are really important for democracy. So in your public square, you want all kinds of opinions, but you don't want anybody who's going to hit somebody over the head with a club or throw acid in their face. We arrest those people. They're a hindrance to what we want from the public square. And to some extent, I think Donald Trump and some other people are like that. Their behavior is such that it really pollutes the public square and prevents us from having the kind of robust democracy we want. So I hope, we hit this event. It was a gigantic event, and the platforms, I guess, weren't really prepared for it, but now we're all talking about it. I hope that there will be clear policies in the future that can be administered in a viewpoint neutral way, so that it does act as a bit of a check on political leaders who have the capacity to rile up violence. And Facebook apparently was instrumental accidentally in a number of group areas of ethnic violence.
So sorry, Nadine?
I just wanted to say that yesterday, Facebook announced that it has passed on a review of this decision to kick off Donald Trump to its new oversight board. And they have, I believe, 90 days to come up with a decision. And Facebook says in advance that it hopes that its decision will be affirmed. But if the oversight board does not affirm the decision, Facebook will follow whatever the oversight board advises.
That's great.
So, so I think it's interesting to see whether these kinds of governance and accountability structures end up ameliorating some of these concerns. I will say one thing to keep in mind, and this is relevant to John's point about viewpoint neutrality, is a vast range of political movements have a law-abiding core and violent fringes. That's true of the anti-police brutality movement. That's true of the pro-life movement. That's was true of the civil rights movement. It was true of the labor movement. It was true of the environmentalist movement, of the pro-gun rights movement, of the I'm sorry, did I mention animal rights movement is another example, which we're seeing some of the issues in the University of California system. So if the standard is somebody who is knowingly riling up people in the course of trying to achieve their political ends, and is aware that some of the people will act violently, that those are the people we want to ban from the public square, then A, that is not actually the standard we use in the public square. because the First Amendment precludes that. The Brandenburg v. Ohio decision defines incitement that's punishable very, very narrowly. And B, if applied fairly, it would apply to a vast, vast range of speakers, potentially, including ones where there's going to be a lot of judgment call about, well, is he really kind of knowingly doing this? What if he does it knowing of, because everybody knows there's violent fringe in some movements, but he does it with genuine regret. Is he speaking excessively? Is he engaging in fake news? Is he speaking too rhetorically? And it's the easiest thing in the world for human beings to always, in these kinds of judgment calls, assume the worst of their adversaries politically and the best of their friends.
Right.
So that's, I think, one reason why, in fact, the courts have defined punishable incitement in the public square quite narrowly. The other thing I want to ask, and this may have something to do with John's point about what role you should see, what should you see as the sole purpose of institutions. One wonders whether at some points things become enough infrastructure companies that even if they're not monopolies the same way that the phone company is a monopoly, we should demand either by law or by custom that they not try to block things because they disapprove of the messages on it. And the example there is the blacklisting of Parler. Because one thing that's often said to people who are being kicked off of Twitter is, hey, you don't like Twitter's policy, start your own company. So they do. They start Parler, and now Parler is blocked from the Apple Store, blocked from the Google Store, blocked from Amazon Web Services. In theory, they may be able to find out hosting, but I'm not sure. I think so far it hasn't quite happened yet. And then the worry is, what if the hosts will then? Big tech's view seems to be that you're not just going to be punished if you kind of knowingly say bad things yourself, that simply providing an unmoderated space where you're not suppressing speech that is dangerous. That itself, you are acting as if you were the government subject to those things, more or less, I oversimplify here. That itself is something that should get you blacklisted because it makes you too dangerous. It's kind of like if, let's say, there was a restaurant or let's say a coffee house, which, had speakers, and some of the speakers were extremist speakers, and their view is, hey, we are a let it all hang out kind of place. We will let anybody hear. If then, if maybe the shipping companies and the Teamsters Union would refuse to deliver things there, and if maybe some of the utilities would cut off service to them, especially if they're not somehow regulated monopolies already, I think we might say, that's going too far. It's one thing if you decide you're not going to do business with a publisher, let's say, that picks and chooses which books to publish. But if you're saying even providing a free speech zone is so pernicious that we're going to blacklist you, that might be something that is ultimately too harmful to free speech, because it makes it impossible for people to come up with these sort of rival places that have a different moderation policy.
It's so interesting because it's where cancel culture meets the antitrust concept of canceling your potential competition. And so those users who I agree with in part of what John was getting at, insofar as I think it's important for platforms to be able to choose to create different environments. They shouldn't all have to strictly protect all this free speech that the US government would have to protect. Ideally, there would be a range of options of content moderation policies that users could choose. But in fact, when Parler came up with an attempt at a more pro-free speech approach, I was happy to do a couple of interviews on Parler. I supported that ambition. And by the way, I really get riled when I hear mainstream media constantly misdescribe Parler as, the bastion of right-wing extremists. It happened that perhaps some conservatives and some right-wing extremists found that was the only platform that would host them, but it was basically intended to be for free speech. And yet the supposed option that we have from a free speech perspective, from an economic choice perspective, is being squashed by the giants.
Professor Strossen, do you expect to see any other alternative sites or social media apps treated the same way as Parler?
There's nothing stopping that abuse of power at the moment. I know Parler went to court. I heard that there was great pressure on their lawyers to drop them. I guess they found other lawyers as well. And the lawsuit so far has not been particularly successful. I haven't had a chance to look at the allegations in detail, but basically I think this kind of behavior, unless or until there's some revamping and enforcement of antitrust laws that may or may not apply, I don't see any other legal constraints. And so what we're seeing are enormous, I'll use an economic term, barriers to entry. What company would think that it could succeed where Parler has failed?
Right, and this is actually part of the problem, I think, with a lot of kinds of speech restrictions. Even if each one is modest on its own, when they're especially part of a broader movement, there's little reason to think that it'll just be the one. In fact, it wouldn't really be very fair if Parler were blocked and then some other company, LARPer, comes up, has the same business model. I mean, why would Amazon Web Services turn around and say, oh, no, you're fine? Presumably, if they have some concern about equal treatment, not even legally mandated, but just, making sure that we act consistently, they probably say, well, we've set a precedent. By the way, precedent is something that theoretically operates as a legal matter in courts, but I think in all human institutions, at least all in our society, precedent is a very powerful force. Analogy is a very powerful force. Think of any organization you've ever been in when there was a meeting of some committee and they say, well, what should we do about it? Somebody says, well, here's what we did 3 years ago. That becomes a focal point. The question now is, why should we depart from that rather than let's just redo things from scratch and reanalyze things from scratch, among other things, because it's too time consuming, too effortful to constantly analyze everything from scratch. So all these things do become precedents, and they lead to other things happening the same way in the future. And the chilling effect that Nadine describes, which is now somebody's trying to figure out if to invest money in this sort of thing, and they say, well, we should expect that what happened before will happen again. So that's what's so pernicious about these things that can't be captured by just, okay, you've lost this one little thing. What's the big deal? Well, the little things add up.
Professor Haidt, I kind of wanted to pull on a thread that you kind of hinted at a couple minutes ago when you were talking about employees at a lot of these organizations putting in a lot of pressure. In your book, The Coddling of the American Mind, you talk a lot about something you call campus safetyism. I'm wondering if you could give a quick definition of that, and if you think what we're now seeing is campus safetyism extending well beyond the campus.
Sure. So, what Greg and I noticed, Greg noticing it first, was that the arguments for banning speakers and books and ideas were of course, students back in the 60s were doing this too, but they weren't saying that these speakers will harm us, will kill us, will traumatize us. And so Greg noticed a new language of safety and harm. And we link this to broader trends of overprotection that were happening beginning in the 80s and especially the 90s, in which even though the crime rate was plummeting in the 90s, American parents freaked out and acted as though if they ever took their eye off their kids, the kids would be abducted or something terrible would happen. So for a variety of reasons, Gen Z, that is people born 1996 or later, Gen Z was vastly overprotected, not given time just to be out alone, learning to take risks on their own. And they were raised in a real culture in which safety was the prime virtue. And while safety for most people means primarily physical safety, we began to see this, what's called concept creep, the idea of safety extended to emotional safety, and then just to things that offend me. So, so this big change that happened in the culture on college campuses around 2015, 2016 in there reflected the rise of this notion of safety in the classroom. And it's kind of illustrated, we're playing different games. If the teacher is trying to present ideas or provocations or elicit emotions or really get engagement, but the students are playing a different game and they see themselves and each other as vulnerable, and their goal is to protect vulnerable students and keep out offensive ideas. Then you get incoherence in the classroom, incoherence in the university. So we were trying to, this new language of safety, in our book, I think I have the definition here. It's Safetyism refers to a culture or belief system in which safety has become a sacred value, which means that people become unwilling to make trade-offs demanded by other practical and moral concerns. So, if you give everybody, when are you unsafe? Is there a reasonable person standard? No, it's if anyone feels unsafe, they are unsafe, and we have to change things to accommodate that. So that's bad enough on campus. Has it spread further out? We saw a big rise in employee activism during the Trump administration. The first year of the Trump administration, politics was flowing into the business world. We saw especially CEO activism. We saw CEOs saying, no, we're not. We're opposed to Trump, or we're not going to, service the NRA. Delta Airlines revoked some sort of program ahead with the NRA. So at first there was a lot of CEO activism, but then by 2018, especially with the Me Too movement, you get a big rise of employee activism, and then that extends to other topics, so that now, because employees they all have access to social media, they have Slack channels, so employee activism has grown greatly. They sometimes will use the language of safety, but they're not generally Gen Z, so I don't think they really feel that they're truly in danger. They might use it rhetorically. So I think the rise of employee activism, especially in tech, journalism, media, arts, there are certain industries that lean left and that recruit from our elite universities. In those fields, we are seeing the language of safety, but I don't think that millennials and Gen X workers truly believe that they are going to be victims of violence if somebody says what they call violent ideas.
So I think all of that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to add one extra twist, which is that a lot of the rhetoric that is used these days is rhetoric of the emotional fragility of minority groups, and also sometimes of women, although it's maybe a little complicated in that area. So one thing that somebody pointed out, actually, that feminism in the past was "I am woman, hear me roar." Yeah. That some, at least, feminism today is "I am woman, I am super vulnerable." And the feminists of the past actually often worried about attempts to shield women from difficult work conditions, sometimes laws that, for example, set up lower maximum working hours for women, that in theory that protected women, but in practice that made them less desirable to please. So let me give you one specific example, and it's from what I think of as what I've labeled the Great Hominin Panic of 2020. So there is a professor at USC who teaches business communications, but also is a student of US China business relations. He speaks Mandarin, and he is involved with an institute at the USC Business School, which deals with business with China. Obviously, tremendously important for America, and in particular in Los Angeles. So he was the subject of one of these mobs that the school, at least at first, gave into, because in teaching a class on business communications, or teaching at least a class session on business communications, he was talking about filler words, things like like. And it turns out, as from what I understand, that he was quite right in so saying, that the Mandarin and possibly other dialects of Chinese filler word, at least in many places, is nega, which means literally that. So you'd say that. And it sounds like nega, which of course sounds like a racial slur in English, but English is not God's own language, right? There happen to be other languages, and I hear one of them, namely Mandarin, has a considerable number of speakers. So he, being a fluent speaker, wasn't even really that focused on the similarity, because one feature of being a fluent speaker is you don't think about how the words of the language sound in another language, you just say them. So in any case, the students said, this is horrible that he is, and in context it was quite clear, he wasn't using the racial slur, but that he is saying a word that sounds that way. All right, so note how they framed it. The petition and the business school's response giving into the petition was all about how, I'm quoting here, our mental health has been affected. This causes emotional exhaustion. And then the business school likewise echoed that language. That, I think, is actually a slander against Black Chinese language learners and Black business people. It's essentially saying, if you hire a Black USC student or Black American generally, in a place where they may be sent on a business trip to Shanghai, let's say, or have to work in Beijing, or even have to work in America around a lot of Mandarin speakers, their mental health will be damaged simply by hearing ordinary Mandarin spoken in ordinary ways. That cannot possibly be good for the professional futures of Black American future business people, given the importance of business with China and the importance of Mandarin in the world. If a Klansman wanted to find out some way of torpedoing Black Americans' chances with Chinese businesses, which I'm told many of them are already pretty racist, racism being a common feature in human existence, he would say, oh, you can't hire Black Americans because, they get really traumatized by simply hearing ordinary Mandarin spoken. So
that kind of, I'm so sorry.
Yes, no.
Yeah, please jump in. We're short on time, so I want to make sure
I'm sorry. So
gets...
it's a long story, but that's my concern, is that this language of threats to mental health is actually damaging to the very people it's supposedly protecting.
And that paternalism, since women were thrown in, and this is something I've debated for many years as a pro-liberty feminist, it reminds me of a famous line in a Supreme Court decision by the great liberal Justice William Brennan, but he took it from an ACLU brief written by the great then ACLU lawyer Ruth Bader Ginsburg, striking down a supposedly protective law for women. He said, this reflects romantic paternalism, which, far from putting women on a pedestal, actually puts them in a cage.
Whoa. It's a wonderful line. I think we're close to time. I do have one final question I really want to hear from all of you on. I am an optimist, and to the extent that you can, if each of you could kind of make the case for what makes you optimistic about the future of cancel culture, perhaps its defeat. Professor Haidt, would you be able to start?
Sure. So a lot of survey work shows that most people hate cancel culture, political correctness, and wokeness, even most people on the left. In the Hidden Tribes study, this wonderful study, there are 7 groups. It's only one group, the progressive activists, that think that this stuff is good. So we have a lot of preference falsification at universities and in other places where almost everybody's on the left. If a lot of people are hiding what they really feel, but they're saying they support something, then there's the chance that it could change very quickly. If we can find an alternative, a different way of talking about or working on or reducing racism and sexism, I think we could see the sort of the rule of or the hegemony or of sort of the wokesters. They could become a laughingstock pretty quickly all of a sudden. That's a possibility.
Great. Professor Strossen?
Me optimistic, in addition to John's very fine points, are programs like these. There is such a growing interest in and opportunity to learn about and empower people to raise their voices, because I also just read a survey similar to what John talked about, which shows that most people in this country are not politically active at all. And unfortunately, unfortunately, they are not raising their voices at all to counter the excesses of cancel culture. So I think every opportunity that we have, including through forums like this, to tell people what a big difference they can make by raising their voices. As my favorite ACLU t-shirt puts it, you have the right not to remain silent.
True. And so those are excellent points. Let me just add, the law is pretty good on a lot of these things. The judges recent years have been pretty good. By and large, mostly judges from the left and from the right and from the center. So once these cases come to court, once all the procedural hoops are jumped through, I'm sure I don't need to tell the lawyers in the audience about that, they often win. And while often there's some considerable resistance on the part of university administrators, even once the court decisions come down, court decisions make a difference. So I think this is stuff that's worth fighting in court. It's a long slog, but it's worth doing, and you usually win.
Wonderfully put, all of you. I'm terribly sorry to all the questions we didn't have a chance to get to. And I want to encourage everybody who was watching, who wants to hear more about what can be done. You can, of course, check out Pacific Legal Foundation and Jim Manley's team for what they are doing. And then each of these speakers, you can find them all over the internet, fighting for free expression, in the most poignant ways, and we have been thrilled to host all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.